Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Africa. I am the program lead, strategic intelligence at E3G, and I'm very happy to have a very interesting panel this afternoon. We are looking at the geopolitics of climate in the context of very significant geopolitical shifts that's been happening over the last few years, the last decade or so, and coming quite sharply into focus now. So just by way of introduction, excuse me, we have David Lammy, who's joining us. David is the Labour Member of Parliament for Tottenham. In November 2021, he was appointed Shadow Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs. And he previously served as Labour Shadow Secretary of State for Justice and as Shadow Lord Chancellor. David. Welcome. Then we have Rachmat Kaimuddin. Rachmat will be joining us. He is the Deputy Coordinating Minister for Maritime Affairs and Investment in Transport and Infrastructure in Indonesia, and closely involved in the Just Energy Transition Partnership process. And then lastly, we have Kristin Tilley. Kristin is Australia's climate envoy. She's been since November 2022. She has a long background in climate policy and COP negotiations. And when taking a break from climate, was the head of Australian government's Office of Supply Chain Resilience in 2021-22. Thank you, and welcome to our panelists. We are dealing with an issue that can take up a lot of time, but we have 30 minutes. So we are gathering here at a time when the geopolitics that we are experiencing and that's impacting on climate diplomacy and climate policy is combustible and fragile. We find ourselves in a very tense geopolitical moment, a moment where the progress we've had in climate negotiations, from agreeing global goals to showing the feasibility of net zero, moving from Paris to Glasgow, to building confidence in all countries that net zero is deliverable and beneficial for all, and that this will be supported by the developed world in partnership with the developing world. These partnerships, obviously, it goes beyond aid. It's not just about, donor funding, providing aid. These partnerships are intensely strategic and political. And, for example, it addresses trade, migration, critical raw minerals, to mention a few. How governments support these objectives is what we want to explore here. What works and what doesn't work. We are going to start with David, if I may. As the world faces simultaneous crises, all of them of significant geopolitical impact, tackling joint nature and climate challenges with collective action becomes more and more challenging. We find that the G20 is not working effectively. The UNFCCC is reaching its limits. As the world becomes more fragmented and more polarized in some ways, we find that global trust is eroding. How can partnerships between the global north and the global south be reset? And how do you see the role of the UK in that process of resetting and building partnerships?
Well, look, thank you very much. And I'm wearing my on-cloud trainers because I'm meant to be campaigning. and I'm taking some time out to be with you because in the end, there is no more important challenge facing our planet than this one. So if I couldn't get away with spending some time with this community during a campaign, what is it all about? So the first thing is simply leadership. And I am staggered that I sit here hoping for the Labour Party to get over the line on the 4th of July, hoping to be the UK's next Foreign Secretary, but very sadly at a moment in time when under Rishi Sunak, we have backtracked on our climate commitments globally and squandered our leadership role. And so if we do get over the line, the first thing is leadership, and I take that leadership very, very seriously indeed. And of course, for us, it's on many fronts because we also are understandably not sitting where we should be with our friends and partners in the global south. Why? Because we hoarded vaccines at a time when we could have been more generous. 2, because we cut overnight our aid budget, and then what was left, we're spending a lion's share of it housing people claiming asylum in the UK. So for all of those reasons, we are in a bad place. And leadership is important. Leadership is particularly important at a time, sadly, where these issues are still up for debate, and those who are not of my political tradition are gaining currency in parts of Europe, other parts of the world, and maybe moving in a different direction. So I think it's hugely important that if we have the privilege to serve, the Labour Party is in a leadership position once again, and putting the UK in a leadership position. And I pay credit actually to what we've seen in the United States under Joe Biden. And I'm pleased when I'm in the United States that there's a lot in the IRA that it's being suggested is not going to be rolled back by a change of administration, if there were to be a change of administration in their election next year. And then to focus on the strengths, we are still the 6th richest economy in the world. We have a seat on the Security Council. We're a G7, G20 nation. On the G20, it can work effectively, and I'm minded and reminded of the role that Gordon Brown played when he was in a leadership position in our country in really seeing the birth of the G20 as we know it today, dealing with a huge global crisis at that time, the crisis after 2008. And this crisis is even deeper and more sustained. So multilateralism is key, and our party, my party, is committed to that multilateralism. It's not a go-it-alone approach to how we move forward. Then we've also got the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth at a time when countries like Togo, Gabon are joining the Commonwealth, important because small island states in the Caribbean and in the Pacific look to the UK for that leadership. And I think particularly on the issue of climate finance, which I think we'll return to, the position of the City of London, where we are sitting, requires the United Kingdom to step up and join forces with the World Bank and others to see the reform, to find the mechanisms for more funding, particularly at a time when all across the world a cost of living crisis is making it hard to make the case solely for taxpayers' funding. So there's a lot we can do. I hope I get the opportunity after July the 4th. I recognize not everyone in this room has a vote.
Thank you, David. Minister Kaimuddin, talking about partnerships, the JETPs are generally seen as an innovation by Western partners, especially on energy transition support, aiming to combine finance, high-level political commitment, and institutional framework support. What made such a deal initially appealing to Indonesia, and how has your experience been in implementing and partnering around the JETP?
Thank you, David. Pleasure to be here, everybody. Maybe quickly, if I may explain about how we in Indonesia look at energy transition. For us, it's a very, very critical issue, climate change, and therefore decarbonization and energy transition. Why? We are a country with 280 million people. We live in the equator. We have 17,500 islands. A lot of our people live in the coastal area. So global warming, climate change, what have you, really is impacting us first. And yeah, sadly also, in terms of economy, we are a G20 country, but compared to many other countries, our GDP per capita is still relatively low. We actually have about less than $5,000 today. And therefore, our ability to do something is actually relatively limited compared to the G7. And when you look at the energy transition situation, today we are still in the very early stage. About maybe 86% of our energy today, both in electricity, transport, industries, are still coming from fossil. And of course, we need to change it. Yeah? And of course, mostly like, coal for electricity, coal for industry, and oil for transportation are the 75% of this problem. So the Pareto is there. So electricity shifting is very, very critical. But also, we are faced with the situation of, yes, we have the wind and solar. We have a lot of solar power, for example, because in the equator. But today, we still have very young coal-fired power plants. The age maybe about 10 to 13 years. So these are very, very big issues. To retire them, you need maybe about $35 billion worth of grants. So this is all the challenge. And therefore, we know that we need support. We need help. We cannot do this alone, especially if we want to be more ambitious. So when the G7 comes to us and offer this potential collaboration in JETP, of course, at that time, this is just prior to our G20 presidency, we believe that this is an amazing opportunity to engage. Of course, we also have our healthy skepticism. Sometimes, the delivery of this support maybe have some issues, but I think if given the choice to engage or not, I think it's very, very important to engage. And then we also know that given the complexity of Indonesia, if we could work together, if we can find solution for Indonesia, that could be a good platform or example for other countries in the other developing nation. And obviously, this is a good example of global North and South collaboration. So I would say the JETP so far, we announced it in 15th of November, 2022, so about 1.5 years, give or take, right now. As a political commitment, I think has been quite successful, quite well. In Indonesia, the effort, the partnership has basically become a catalyst for us to sit down together, rethink about our energy transition, how can we do more, become more ambitious. On the financing support, I think there is slightly, what I can say is maybe not as easy to deploy as possible, as imagined before, because a lot of this funding that is provided are market-based, has to be bankable, while some of this energy transition may not be necessarily bankable. For example, shutting down coal-fired power plant is a value-destructive project, so it has to be funded, for example, with concessional or grants. But on the other, like renewable development, I think that is fine. So we are hoping that this year, after planning, after discussion, we will we'll have a few of these, I would say, flagship projects happening this year. So watch this space.
Thank you. Kristin, you find yourself in a part of the world that is experiencing these geopolitical shifts at, quite intensely. If we look at the rising geopolitical tensions in the Asia Pacific and the differences in perspective, for example, on the role of gas affecting the chance to keep warming within 1.5 degrees, how has Australia's climate diplomacy changed to support the Paris goals and to accelerate action in that part of the world where you are?
Thanks very much, David, and thanks to E3G for the invitation to be part of this panel. I think I'll just build off something that David Lammy started with, which is leadership and ambition and commitment. And so we had a change of government about 2 years ago in which it was effectively, our Labor Party that's in government was effectively elected on a stronger and more ambitious climate platform. And when it came into government, set about very clearly doing some of those things as government priorities. So increasing our 2030 target, legislating our 2030 and net zero by 2050 targets. And for some period of time, Australia, that immediately translated into Australia being welcomed with very open arms and brought onto stages and asked to speak because of that ambition and that leadership. I think what we've found, and much of that was around our own domestic decarbonisation ambition and commitments. What we've seen as well, though, and going to your question, David, about the region that we exist in, the Indo-Pacific, and very clearly our Prime Minister, our Foreign Minister have said many times, that region is in a state of permanent competition. And that makes things more challenging and difficult, and Australia as part of the Pacific in particular, part of the architecture of the Pacific, so the Pacific Island Forum, we do see ourselves as a key partner and partner of choice of some of the developing country nations in the region. When you listen to them, you engage them, and you hear what they're saying, climate change is the number one economic, developmental and security issue for Pacific nations for very obvious reasons. And so understanding where the Pacific is coming from, what their existential interests are in a stronger global response to climate change, and making climate a central part of our foreign policy relationships, but certainly also our security relationships and our development partnerships, has really enabled us to hardwire and demonstrate, yes, ambition and leadership, but increasingly implementation by the way that we're working on joint projects or architecture or declarations, for example, around continuity of statehood in the face of sea level rise. So I think it's, I just close by saying it's the leadership and the ambition is vitally important, but then taking it forward in a way that meets those key countries that we're working with where they are and where their priorities are has been vital.
Thank you. David, we know that one of the biggest issues, if not the biggest issue, in climate diplomacy is finance. The challenge there is enormous. While the developed economies have just reached the 100 billion mark, much of this is still loans and hard to access, especially for developing countries. How do you view, and what sort of action would Labour take to reform and accelerate changes in the international financial architecture to facilitate support for the climate transition?
Well, look, let me begin by saying that clearly a change of government in the UK affords us the opportunity to be in full solidarity and partnership with those that have championed this issue but have been unable to do anything about it, because they do require genuine partnership from a country like the United Kingdom. So when I say that, I'm thinking of my friend Mia Motley in Barbados, and I look forward to partnering with her on the agenda that she kicked off. I think President Ruto in Kenya has also made this a significant issue. I look forward to partnering with him. That is what democracy can bring about, and the UK needs to step into the mix, and not just with rhetorical statements as we've seen from this government. That's the first thing. The second thing is the levers that we have. Well, clearly the City of London is hugely significant in relation to this. Clearly we do need innovation. The private sector is going to be very important. I was discussing, and will be discussing a bit later today, with the philanthropic community, how we can also lever in the funds that exist there, but they do need a government that they feel able, that they can cohere around over a sustained period, and the kind of hokey-cokey in-out approach doesn't work, and that's why we talk about 10 years of renewal, and I hope that we can deliver that here in the UK, so we can set a course that cannot be changed. So working with the private sector, working with philanthropy, and we need to change the rules, because what we hear time and time again is that the rules were set up in a different age, in a different century. They don't work today. And we are in a leadership, we want to work with AJ Banga and others to help with that rule change, those rule changes, to bring about the innovations that are required. And of course, because of course this does need taxpayers, some taxpayers' funding to stand by, for example, the 11.6 billion that has been pledged, that's under threat, I think, here in the UK, to stand by that money, and I can give that commitment today. So those are the things that I think we can do. I'm hugely excited by the prospect of delivering, and particularly for the poorest people in the world. And you know, when I was with Keir Starmer, with Ursula von der Leyen at the Munich Security Conference, which is pretty hard-edged security gathering here in Europe, it was really interesting that Ursula von der Leyen was raising the really profound issues in the Sahel, in Eastern Africa, how we deal with some of the climate challenges, how we work together with our aid budgets to secure jobs and other things, in part because of the issue of migration. But if countries like the UK have stepped away from assisting at source, we're not going to get the solutions that are required.
Thank you. Maybe let's turn for a moment to what is really a significant, a big issue, and that is China. As one of the powers that is really shaping the future of geopolitics and the background in which climate diplomacy and climate politics is conducted, really internationally, but also in the regions that you represent. Minister Kaimuddin, how does Indonesia see China's Belt and Road Initiative in the region, particularly with reference to energy, renewables, mining investment, and what is Indonesia's approach to engaging China, and how do you compare it to engagement, scale and support that comes from the West?
Okay, let me try to answer that question with a story. So in 2014, when the new president got appointed, we look at how can Indonesia create more industries. And one of what we think is a relatively obvious first step is to add value on our natural resources. Indonesia happened to have the largest, or one of the largest nickel reserves in the world. And nickel ore in Indonesia is actually less than 2% nickel content. 1 to 2%. The rest is actually moisture, dirt. Right? So if you export nickel ore, you're basically exporting mostly dirt and water. So we said, let us stop exporting nickel ore and require the first step of the processing or the refinery to be done in the country. Right? So there is region A, investor from region A or government from region A decided that, okay, we understand that's what you're trying to do. So they invest in a lot of metal refineries in the country, in Indonesia. So, and they provide the market for the product as well. So their capital, their technology, our resources, but job stays in the country, economies improve in the country. And region B sue us in the WTO. Yeah, so you see, if you get that treatment, which one do you prefer? And I think you can guess which one is region A and which one is region B. And I think that is enough said for me.
Thank you, Minister. Kristin, China and Australia recently held the annual leaders meeting and agreed, amongst other things, to resume bilateral dialogues on climate and energy. To put a similar sort of question to you, how does Australia view China's Belt and Road Initiative in the region? And what is your approach to engaging or competing with China on third country partnerships?
Well, I guess if we start at the sort of, what is the objective Australia would like to see for the region around its climate response and energy transition? We want as many partners and as many investments as possible to assist with the region's transition. I touched on the Pacific before. That's very much around resilience building, adaptation. The Pacific still wants to decarbonise very quickly, but the real needs are in that adaptive capacity space. Southeast Asia, as we've heard from Indonesia, it's very much around accelerating and leapfrogging out of the coal-based energy resources into renewables, but in a way that's just and fair. And so I think if your starting point is you understand those are the priorities, and that's where donor country, third-party country investments must focus. We are very supportive of third parties and China and others making those investments. What we've learnt and the way we try and make our own climate investments, and certainly strongly encourage others to do, is do it transparently, do it with no strings attached, do it that responds to partner country priorities, and Rachmat touched on some of those really important things around providing an opportunity for domestic labour in that partner country, infrastructure that meets the needs of that region and is cognizant of climate risks coming for that region, and that certainly where lending and debt is provided, that it is done in a very sustainable way, because certainly we know that countries in the region, some of the smaller countries in the Pacific, have much less fiscal space to be able to repay debts. Particularly, just one very quick example, Pacific Island countries, Vanuatu was hit by 2 Category 4 cyclones within days of each other last year. And each one of those events can wipe double-digit GDP off the economy. We know that will just become more frequent in climate change. So lending on fair terms is a very important part that we encourage all investors in the region to focus on.
Thank you. David, in your manifesto, you're talking about conducting an audit on your relationship, the bilateral relationship with China. How would this impact your engagement, both with China, but also in respect of third country partnerships?
Well, look, let me be
briefly,
clear. There has been no engagement from this government on China. We've seen across Europe, the United States, Australia, despite, of course, areas where we disagree, a lot of engagement, nothing commensurate here on the UK side at all. We've said that there has to be a China audit, an audit of our relationship, because basically the UK has bounced around. We've had 7 different policies on China, from the golden era under David Cameron to Liz Truss. I mean, I struggle always to describe Liz Truss' approach to most things, but she had a position on China that was different to the current position. So we want to be consistent. And what we said in opposition is, of course, we want to cooperate with China where we can. There are areas where we will compete and challenge, but it is important to have that full audit so that we can engage appropriately about the issues that matter. And there is no more important issue in so many ways than the climate issue.
Thank you. Just to conclude, Kristin and then Minister Kaimuddin, in 30 seconds, if you can you summarize to us what countries need to prioritize in the international partnerships to ensure that we stay on track to meet the 1.5 degree objective? Can you summarize for us just in 1 or 2 sentences what countries must prioritize in the international partnerships to ensure that we stay on track for the 1.5 degree objective?
Thank you. What countries must prioritize? Basically, at least for us, we need to create the good plan, and then after that, communicate those plans as well as the problems for developing nations, trying to also get help from external parties, and then execute vigorously on this. I think execution and communication is very key.
I think I'll answer from a sort of international partnership perspective. I think it's turning up, listening, respecting, meeting, and I'll quote our foreign minister, she says this a lot, meeting people where they are, not where you want them to be, and consistency and continuing the dialogue. It takes time, it takes effort, but that is fundamental to deliver the ambition we need for 1.5.
Thank you. David, the same in conclusion.
For us, it's very simple. High ambition. And, you know, there are areas where a country like the UK has to set the example. And that's why the UK Labour Party has said no more new licenses for North Sea oil. And we're really clear about that.
Thank you. Thank you to all 3 of you. I think just a concluding sentence, really, it's clear that the challenge we face is enormous and that no one country or even group of countries on their own can do this. And it requires global cooperation and innovation in the building of partnerships and relationships. Thanks so much.